You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
Welcome back. I am Joel Ostro, professor of political science at Benedictine University. I'm sitting in today for Edwin Eisendrath. And in this second hour, we are going to turn to a really small, insignificant, micro topic that doesn't have too much importance, the Constitution. Just a little background about my experience, and we have two really distinguished, eminent guests who I'm really grateful for joining me today for this conversation. When I was studying Russia, published a book in the mid-2000s about how Russia's attempt to create a democracy failed and how it ended up a new kind of dictatorship. And probably the most significant part of that book was on the Constitution, the process of adopting it, how then President Yeltsin manipulated it individually on his own hand by changing a few lines in the Constitution before it was ratified by the public that essentially rendered that Constitution open to dictatorship. And that experience alerted me to the importance of looking at constitutions comparatively. The University of Chicago has a Center for Comparative Constitutions. I think I got the name right. That was instrumental for me in my understanding how I come to understand most political topics through a comparative lens. Obviously, there are challenges and strains and perhaps even changes happening to our Constitution and how it functions in our country. We are joined now by Geoffrey Stone, the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, former Dean of the Law School at Chicago. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. We met many years ago at Benedictine when the late Jim Ryan, former Attorney General, created a Center for Civic Leadership, and I believe it was his first of many symposia that he held. It was after the adoption of the Patriot Act, and you joined us and gave an incredible historical context to concerns and actions around First Amendment rights and the Patriot Act and how those First Amendment rights have changed throughout history. So I'm really pleased and grateful to you for joining us, because there's certainly a perception that these rights are again under challenge, perhaps transformation through recent actions by the court and the Trump administration. So first of all, thank you very much for coming on today.
Thanks so much for having me, Joel. It's great to see you again.
So maybe you could just give a real general, how do you read the current situation regarding the court, this administration around those fundamental rights? How do you put it into context? We can take the conversation from there.
Well, first of all, in terms of this administration, I think it's fair to say that Trump has really no regard for our fundamental constitutional rights. He believes that he has essentially unlimited power and regards the limitations on those powers as unwarranted and unjustified. And he is prepared to put in place policies and try to implement laws that disregard the fundamental principles and rights of the American people. This poses a really unprecedented challenge to American democracy and American constitutional law. And it is essential that Americans and that members of Congress and that the judiciary stand up to this to prevent it from having a truly devastating effect on our nation and on our democracy.
In response to that, is it not this Supreme Court that, in fact, conferred upon the presidency? The media so often says it gave to Trump, and I just hate that. The court has given nothing to Trump. It's given to the presidency that unlimited power by essentially putting presidents above the law, saying they can't be prosecuted. Is that a misreading of that?
I think it's fair to say that this Supreme Court has immunized President Trump and presumably future presidents from all sorts of responsibilities, and also given him a greater degree of authority to regulate American law and policy. One example of that is the idea of the unitary executive. A key question in American law for over a century now has been whether it is possible for Congress to enact laws that create agencies like the Federal Communications Commission, the National Labor Relations Board, the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Reserve, that have commissioners that are independent of the president, that they have terms of office and cannot be removed by the president except for a showing of real cause. And the reason for that is the idea of making these non-political entities. The idea is to have the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, and so on, act in favor of American policies, not in support of what any particular political party or particular president wants. And the Supreme Court in 1935, in Humphrey's Executor, unanimously held that that was constitutional, that the Congress could create these agencies with commissioners who are appointed to serve a specific number of years and to be bipartisan in order to achieve the goals of these agencies. But the Trump administration has very strongly attempted to undermine that, and the Supreme Court has indicated, at least, that it may well be willing to do that. It has agreed to hear a case for the current term called Trump versus Slaughter, involving the Federal Trade Commission, in which Trump claims that the members of the Federal Trade Commission who are appointed as independent commissioners can be removed by him at will. And he's been trying to do this, as we know, across all sorts of agencies.
Across all of them, yeah. Yeah,
and there have been lots of lawsuits about this, but now it's finally come directly to the Supreme Court. Up until now, the Supreme Court, until very recently, has supported Humphrey's executor, but in the last year or two, the Roberts Court has indicated a willingness to rethink that and perhaps overrule that. And that would have a devastating effect on the ability of these agencies to act in a neutral, non-political fashion, which is what they were intended to do.
I'd like to turn this back to the First Amendment. I know that, but at least in my experience with you, that's your passion. What's the greatest threat to those rights that you see, or where is that threat coming from? I mean, obviously there's President Trump and his lack of respect for it, but beyond him, like maybe in the context of the court, or where do you see the greatest threat coming to freedom of press, speech, assembly, those basic rights?
First of all, it's obvious that the Trump administration has taken an extremely aggressive anti-free speech approach to universities, to law firms, and to other entities, essentially withdrawing federal funds from them unless they agree to do what Trump wants them to do. No one would have ever imagined this to be constitutional until the present time. But this is what the Trump administration is doing with institutions like Columbia, University of Pennsylvania, and so on.
Northwestern.
Yeah, Northwestern, exactly. And it's very challenging for universities because they don't want to run the risk of losing huge amounts of money during the time that it takes to litigate these issues, because the Trump administration has withdrawn huge funds from these institutions if they don't immediately agree to his demands. And even if they may win the lawsuits over time, it could be 2 or 3 years without those resources. And to do medical research and healthcare and scientific research, which are highly dependent upon federal funding, losing those resources would be devastating.
Yeah.
So Harvard, because it is so rich, has been willing so far to stand up.
Fear is a powerful weapon in the hands of aspiring dictators, that's for sure. That's their main tool.
And the Supreme Court has, on free speech issues, has been, it has not addressed this question yet. It has not had this issue before yet, exactly. But it certainly demonstrated a willingness to interpret the First Amendment and other constitutional provisions in a way that is consistent with conservative politics.
Yeah.
In Free Speech v. Paxton last year, for example, the court, in a 6-3 decision with all the Republican-appointed justices in the majority, held that Texas could require websites that have sexually explicit materials to verify that anyone who uses the website is an adult and not a child. Now, that might seem a reasonable thing to do. You can't go into a movie theater that shows sexually explicit material without showing that you're an adult, or buy a book in a bookstore. But the Supreme Court had previously held 2 decades ago in the Ashcroft case that the internet is different, because in the internet, once you identify yourself, that information remains there, and it can be used and sold and distributed to others that you've gone to the site, whereas going to a bookstore or going to a movie theater has never had that consequence. And so the chilling effect, the court said, of people willing to go to see material that is constitutionally protected for them would be serious. Thus, what the court said in Ashcroft is that it's up for parents to regulate what their children can do and can't do. But last term, in the Paxton case, the court, in a 6-3 decision, overturned Ashcroft and held that Texas could prohibit websites to make sexually explicit material available unless an individual proves that they are an adult. And again, the problem with that, if you're an adult, is that if you do that on the website, that information that you've accessed that can be then used by the website in all sorts of ways to damage you. And that deters your exercise of your First Amendment rights. Nonetheless, the court now was willing to do that. Another example last term was United States versus Grimetti, a 6-3 decision, again, with all 6 Republican-appointed justices in the majority, in which the court upheld a state law prohibiting certain medical care for transgender minors. This was not a First Amendment issue, but basically held that the law that prohibited healthcare providers from prohibiting puberty blockers for any minor for the purpose of enabling the minor to live with a gender identity different from one at birth was permissible, and that the state can prohibit any doctor from engaging in that medical care. Another example of the court's First Amendment decisions recently is Mahmoud versus Taylor, again a 6-3 decision, in which the court held that parents have a First Amendment right to remove their children from reading any books in schools about LGBTQ people. And the idea that the parents have a First Amendment right to determine what their kids can read or not read in school is unprecedented. And here the court, 6-3, said, well, parents have a right to do that. So these are examples of the court being very activist in terms of achieving conservative political views in the guise of constitutional interpretation.
Can you maybe put into context, and this is related. All these questions are related because it's all about the First Amendment. But obviously, very much in the news of late was CBS's pulling of that segment from 60 Minutes. It is not the first time that CBS has become in the news for being a target, one way or another, of the news, of reporting being a target at CBS. How do you view that specific incident, and can you put it into context for how you see the challenges to the media as a whole, and what that means for us?
For most of the 20th century and the early years of the 21st century, we took for granted the fact that we had a very robust free speech and free press society, in which there were many newspapers, magazines, radio stations, TV stations, many of which were very responsible and thoughtful, from which we could get reliable news, and where government could not intervene in terms of pressuring them to adopt certain positions. Two major things have happened to change all that. One of them is the internet, which means that individuals now are much more likely to get their news from websites on the internet, which are not like New York Times or Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, which provide news in a responsible and reasonably balanced manner. And they get totally distorted news, and they don't know it's distorted because that's all they get. And that has a damning effect upon the effectiveness of our democracy.
Pardon me for interrupting, but often from those with ill intention, like a lot of that generated from places like the Kremlin, particularly in the 2016 election. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's a problem that we face as a democracy right now, which is that we got used to the idea that people had ready access to reliable news and information, that most Americans got their news and information from those sources, and that now that's changed dramatically. And that is a real threat to how we go forward as a political entity. Will our citizens have the news and information they need to have in order to make wise and thoughtful and knowledgeable decisions? And the other part of it, of course, is the government intervening, as you mentioned, and manipulating itself what these entities can do, as in the CBS situation. So, again, I think one of the challenges we face as a nation is the need to take a deep breath and step back and recognize that we face a very different reality in terms of the ability of citizens to obtain reasonably fair, balanced, and reliable information, which we took for granted for much of our history.
People often see the internet as the guarantor of democracy. I'm often on with Joan Esposito, and she's like, "Oh, we have all this information. We have all this information." When I was studying Russia after the collapse, a friend and colleague of mine, Steve Fish, coined this term, hyperdemocracy. Hyperdemocracy is anti-democratic. My example in Russia was they chose not to make any choices. So they had a president and a vice president and a prime minister. Like, if there was an office that could be named, they would have that, because let's have everything. And they would have first past the post elections and proportional elections. If they could have any kind of election, we're just not going to make choices. We have everything. And they ended up having nothing when it came to democracy in the end. I sort of see the internet as part of that. But then perversely, there's the flip side, Jeff, is there are very few owners. I mean, most of the internet is owned by Meta and Google. And not only have we been talking for years about concentration of media ownership of the traditional media, but now we have the government manipulating the ownership of things like CBS. In a way, the government controls who owns those things, or is certainly trying to seize control. Is not concentration of ownership a fundamental threat to the First Amendment?
Absolutely. I mean, the idea that a relatively small number of individuals are wealthy enough to own the major sources of news and information in our country jeopardizes the future of our democracy. So all of these are serious challenges that we need to address in a thoughtful and responsible manner. And in the Trump administration, we're absolutely not doing that.
And with the Roberts Court, we're not. I mean, if such a case were brought before, I don't know how it would even get to the court, challenging somehow the lack of antitrust legislation to break up these media monopolies. What are the odds that this court would hear the case, much less rule in favor of the First Amendment?
Well, I would like to imagine, although I don't know that I can say this with confidence, that in addition to Kagan and the other two liberal justices, that Roberts and Barrett might be willing to be responsible and take some responsible positions. One of the interesting questions is what will happen in Trump v. Slaughter, is whether they'll be willing to do that. Not at all obvious. They have repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to disregard fundamental principles of our Constitution, and overruling Roe v. Wade, for example, overruling the constitutionality of affirmative action. Those were dramatic ideological decisions that overruled prior decisions by relatively moderate to conservative courts, the Berger Court, the Rehnquist Court, by these justices. So the real question here is whether justices like Roberts can take a deep breath and recognize that the future of our democracy is very much now in their hands, and they have to be non-political, non-ideological about it, and look to fundamental principles about which our nation is based. Whether they will do that remains to be seen.
I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion our first encounter regarding the Patriot Act, and I was blown away by the historical context of your presentation, and you've used the word unprecedented several times, and when I hear that from you, that makes me want to push back at the people who work at WCPT who have branded me Dr. Gloom and Doom. When in history have our First Amendment rights faced the next greatest challenge? If this is unprecedented, this is the worst it's been. Like what can we compare it to? What was previously the worst challenge, or the most extreme?
There were two prior moments when we had dramatic limitations on First Amendment rights. One was during World War I.
Yep.
When the Wilson administration adopted legislation, the Espionage Act of 1917, the Sedition Act of 1918, which effectively made it a crime for anybody to criticize the war or the draft.
Yeah. Because
Wilson did not want there to be any disagreement with him about whether going into the war and fighting the war was a good idea. And the Supreme Court upheld those laws during World War I, and thousands of individuals were prosecuted and given lengthy jail sentences, and it had a devastating effect on the ability of individuals to express their views. Later, the court eventually turned around and recognized those decisions were wrong and overruled them, and held that that type of restriction on speech is basically unconstitutional, except for extraordinary circumstances of clear and present danger of grave harm, a test that's almost impossible to meet. The other time in our history when we faced major restrictions on speech was during the Red Scare, when, again, the Supreme Court in the Dennis case upheld the convictions of all the leaders of the Communist Party, basically because they advocated for the Russian government. Again, that decision was later overruled. But at the time, the court failed to live up to its responsibilities. So we have lived through periods of serious suppression of speech, and we'll see where we go this time.
Colleague of mine, Brian Endless at Loyola, and I have done a podcast called the World Discord Podcast that looks at global issues, and we always end our hour discussion with a stupid question, which I want to present to you. If you had a magic wand and could wave it and achieve some kind of realistic change, right? I kind of imagine, like, you have a better court, replace the 6 people on the court. That's not realistic, but like within the realm of reality, if you had a magic wand and could wave it, what would you see as the most significant fix?
Well, I think one would be for the Democrats to take control of the House and or the Senate, so as to at least reduce the legislation that could take place. And the other would be for the justices on the Supreme Court, particularly Roberts and Barrett and perhaps one or two others, to take a deep breath and recognize that they have a fundamental responsibility to protect the core values of our nation when they are in jeopardy, as they are today, and to stand up to that. And they have cases before them, and it will be coming before them in the next few years, in which they could make a real difference. So that I don't think that's impossible. So I hope very much that it occurs.
Well, from your lips to their ears, Professor Geoffrey Stone, Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, former Dean of the Law School. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. We have to go to a break. It's been great talking to you again. Happy holidays. Happy New Year to you.
My pleasure. Same to you. It's a pleasure.